Now, when I was young, I would practice shamanic techniques of perception while interpreting them as a form of mathematics, as I mentioned. Now, my grandfather, also told me that this was the kind of mathematics which wasn't going to be found in any books, right? Reading is a sub-operation of perceiving, is another thing he used to tell me. And in the raw contact, there's statements to the effect that it is difficult for humans, which they called third density entities, that's our evolutionary cycle, to perceive what they called thought forms. And this is precisely what my grandfather taught me how to do, and my sister, and many other people. And he had at least 12 grandchildren. He had actually more. Now we have about 15 grandchildren, if my count is correct. And he had 8 children. So, he had a massive family. And I greatly benefited from these teachings. I mean, these teachings didn't stray me away from science, but allowed me to compartmentalize the scientific method over here, the axiomatic method over here, but always trying to hybridize and fusionally cross-interpret them so that I wasn't getting stuck in empiricism or just rationalism. Shamanism is always is designed to integrate and hybridize and ultimately fuse. Now, let me continue by saying that ever since I came into contact with the raw material, which was approximately, I believe, 2017, 2018. I can't quite remember. I think it was late 2017, early 2018. I was stunned not only by the linguistic congruence between it and what my grandfather taught me, but there was something quite intimate about an otherwise remote contact. Ra does not speak colloquially. Right? Ra speaks quite esoterically with poetic dosages and even getting theoretic in certain respects. Something, though, felt so intimate and inviting that I couldn't help but basically become obsessed with studying it and taking certain adages to heart, as well as insights that go beyond adages. One of the main insights that Ra discusses, and they didn't regard this as of the utmost importance, but I did, and that is the source of all illness, or we could say injury and illness in the body complex, is resulting from one of two things. Either let me see if I can formulate this without being too wishy-washy, but also not being imprecise. One is either ignoring, or this is the first option. One is either ignoring or unable to use what they called a mental or spiritual catalyst, which means that your spirit complex, which we would call the soul, but they attributed structure to the soul, that's why they called it spirit complex, was programming and was bestowing on the mind complex to decode as a symbology. And if it does not, then it becomes a symptomology. Now, the symptomology need not be physiological. Symptoms can be generalized to physical states. Any physical state would be a symptom doubling as a symbol of the mind complex. And so you have these body-mind mappings that are programmed and conducted by the spirit complex. Now, this seems very intuitive to those who are intuitive thinkers. To those who are rational thinkers, this is unjustified and imprecise and wishful thinking and so on. So I set out to study the raw contact in the context of the CTMU, or the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, and trying to use CTMU technical language, importing the raw contact into CTMU technical language. Now, the result of this importation is a book titled Concurrence, which is an informational sequel to the raw contact, and whose methodology I will discuss when the time is right. I don't want to discuss it yet. What I can say, and I've shared before with others, is that others on this channel and elsewhere, is that I did not unconsciously channel Ra in the same way Carlo Rucker did, through what they called tuned trance telepathy. This was a kind of conscious telepathy, an interdensity translation from perceptual telepathy, general telepathy, whereby percepts in general are used to communicate, to what they called verbal telepathy, which is when you use verbal or more notational percepts to communicate, right? Generalizing, verbalization to mathematization, mathematical notation, which is basically what we understand all of science in terms of. But let me not get carried away. What I'd like to do is recount a dream that I had, which it's difficult to speak about this in a way that is not going to alienate or frustrate a lot of our audience here. So what I often do is, before I go to sleep, I request different dreamscapes. Sometimes I request a fun dreamscape, a wacky fun dreamscape. Sometimes I request a dreamscape that's going to symbolically inform my daily life in some way. Sometimes I request a dreamscape in which I can communicate with a loved one who is passed or discarnated, as I call it, someone who is no longer activated in the incarnation with which I'm familiar, but is now experiencing their discarnation, which is, of course, incarnation, discarnation are coupled in the same way that, instantiation and programming are coupled. The discarnation is the programming domain, the non-terminal programming and processing domain, using CTMU terminology, and the incarnations occur as instantial executions of that domain, terminal instantial executions. But anyway, when I go to sleep, I interpret dreams. This is also part of shamanic phenomenology, by the way. But I interpret dreams as a more direct way to experience the non-terminal programming processing domain. And that allows for different dreamscapes to not only emerge into what we can call oniric consciousness, but also interrelate in ways that are purely symbolic and emotional and cannot be easily verbalized or visualized. But they can be emotionalized, shall we say. And while requesting a more direct dream with Ra, what I was imagining was some kind of localized experience of Ra in body complexes that I could perceive. And in a way, this was fueled by a passionate kind of curiosity with an entity which seemed extremely familiar. And I'll discuss more about how there are certain synchronicities that suggest that Ra is quite intimately involved in our what they call planetary harvest, and therefore with each and every one of us in different ways. A kind of angelic, oracular entity, shall we say. But I'll set that aside for now. I don't have my thoughts fully gathered to describe that with any degree of lucidity. But this dream manifested as a kind of sequence, and if you're familiar with the original Ra contact, you'll know that densities are evolutionary cycles, and the evolutionary cycles have certain prerogatives, meaning birthrights, and imperatives, meaning goals. Now, the birthright can be thought of as a kind of valence of consciousness, and the goals can be thought of as drives of intelligence, consciousness and intelligence being coupled, of course. Now, I'm not going to go through the densities right now, but what I will say is that I was focusing on the denser triad, meaning fourth, fifth, and sixth density. Fourth density is associated with love, whether individual or universal, whether service to self or service to others. Wisdom is associated with wisdom in service to self or wisdom in service to others, an extremely free density in which entities can explore vast reaches of programming and executing. Just leave that there. And sixth density, which unites love and wisdom into wise love, and therefore is all about what they call the law of one. Okay, that's why the original Ra contact was titled Teaching the law of one. It should have been titled Teaching, Learning the Law of One, because teaching and learning is always coupled as well. These couplings are native to CTMU structure and dynamics, self-dual structure and teleodynamics. So this was a natural blending of language, esoteric and poetic and meta-theoretic language. So here's how the dream went. I fell asleep and I was situated semi-locally, actually more so atmospherically. I wasn't localized into a human body. I had this kind of panoramic perception. Another shamanic technique which dreams help to train you in. Get into that later as well. I plan an entire series on oniric consciousness and the experiences of dreams. But anyway, let me not get sidetracked here. The first scenario, let's say, in which I was panoramically set was one in which a childhood friend who was actually the son of my mom's friend, he was kind of an acquaintance, but whenever we saw each other, this was pre, cell phones and really pre widespread internet access. So I didn't really communicate with him except on sparing occasions when we had holiday parties and things like that, when our families got together with family friends. So I was friendly with him. He was a bit younger, actually, about 3 years younger. And it's striking that it was not a close friend. It was a kind of acquaintance / more distant, intermittent friend. And one of the things I noticed about my friend's relationship with his father, and I was young. I was maybe 12 and he was 9. These are the years that we're talking about. I was 11, 12, he was 8, 9. I'd noticed we'd play sports together, and his father would always compare him to me in a negative way. So we were throwing the football, and he's like, "Why can't you throw it like him? I mean, look at him. Look at your pansy-ass throws." His father would talk to him this way. I didn't know how to react except to say that, well, I'm a lot older, so, my coordination is more developed. I've been playing longer, blah, blah, blah. But it made me quite uncomfortable. And his father would essentially berate him in comparison to me, 3 years older, and very different body types. And we were both thin and athletic, but, I was more interested in sports, and he wasn't as interested in them. But we played all kinds of sports together, and this was a common situation. And in this scenario, his father was berating him to the point of drowning him in a kind of, I'm not going to describe the dreamscape in detail because it's difficult, but basically we were in an indoor mall, and the fountain in the mall was a kind of a flat stream, maybe a foot deep enough so that if you lied in it and you kind of sunk to the bottom, there would be enough, about a foot above you, so you could drown in it, in other words. And he was drowning his son. And I somehow immediately localized, I went from this panoramic perception to a localized perception and had a human body all of a sudden, right? As in dreams, we substitutively cycle between bodies, and I immediately began to resuscitate him. As soon as I approached him, the father took a seat in one of these, I forget what they're called, these makeshift chairs that you pull up when you go to the beach or when you sit at a Little League game or a baseball game or whatever. And he just watched us. He watched me as I resuscitated him, and then after I managed to resuscitate him, which I don't know how, it was a very visceral experience. I had to do, mouth to mouth, basically. And I was, kind of carrying him around like this. He was a bit shorter than me. I think must have been, if I were to approximate our age, when we were kids. So I was walking him around and making him sort of regain consciousness and regain oxygenation in the brain and all that. So this happened for what appeared to be in linear terms, which most dreams aren't linear, but there were, intermittent linear intervals here for about 30 minutes. It was but while I was doing this, I was experiencing a dual feeling of the utmost compassion for this kid, my friend, really. A deep friendship that was fueled by compassion as well as mercy for the old man who was just glaring at us. And when I woke up, well, actually, I didn't wake up yet because I had another. There was a sequence here that was associated with what I did. Was I Let me actually pause because I don't want to give it away. So then Dreamscape shifts into an apartment. My wife and I were touring apartment buildings, and there was this extremely nice apartment, very spacious, but mid-century style, right up our alley. I like a little bit of classic medieval. I'm, I have maybe a bit of a weird blend of styles that I like, but we were touring this apartment, and the price was too good to be true. I mean, it was like this, almost four-bedroom apartment. I forget, it must have been New York City because that's where we were living at the time. And the price came through as like maybe $1,000 for a four-bedroom apartment, extremely spacious and just the perfect style. It was our dream, even though we both love houses more, it was our dream apartment. And we were about to sign the lease right then and there. But just in a flash, I had this intuition that they were scamming us and that we were actually signing away much more money than we thought. And it was in the fine print. And, my vision somehow hyper focused on the fine print, which wasn't there, but it appeared. And that's when I saw that it was actually going to be $6,000 per month. And that was way out of our budget, blah, blah, blah. Then I teleported into the back of a cab, which is stuffy and cramped. The atmosphere was so thick, viscous, and I was wearing a huge jacket that I somehow couldn't take off. And I've always suffered from motion sickness since I was a kid, and the motion sickness was getting so intense that I was going to pass out, which is what it's been for ever since I was a kid. And I've since learned to manage it through a kind of meditative trance that I can talk about. But in that moment, I knew, so I was trapped in this cab, and I was trapped in this hot, viscous atmosphere that was making me so nauseous as to hate my physical body. I hated feeling trapped in the cab in my body, but I couldn't help it. I knew that something consigned me to this fate, and I fused with that state of harrowing panic and despair, and I somehow accepted it and learned that, internalized this lesson, which is that despair and panic and harrowing feelings of pain are somehow deepening the joy and the wisdom of life. Not a groundbreaking insight intellectually, but viscerally, it felt groundbreaking. And at that moment, my entire panorama shifted to a slowly scrolling text, which I couldn't quite decipher at first, but then I started to focalize my vision and noticed that it was the raw contact text, which I was kind of scrolling through slowly. And then I woke up, and I immediately knew, okay, this is first of all such an educational dream. But I experienced fourth density universal love when I was resuscitating and then calming down and stabilizing my friend. Wisdom when I realized that, when I intuited that I was getting scammed, my wife and I were getting scammed. And of course, these are, sort of trivial symbolic instances, but viscerally they felt so profound. And I don't have a lot of dreams in which I am locally experiencing my panorama. It's usually, I've learned to kind of reason on dreams in event by event, emotion by emotion, rather than by state, because I'm almost never in a fixed localistic body. For better or worse, that's neither here nor there. That'll be for the Oniric Consciousness series. And finally, the cab ride, where I had to merge and accept that harrowing, panicking despair, was the density of unity in which I had to unite love and wisdom. And of course, Ra sort of more directly revealed their authorship of the dream when, in the close, and many of my dreams are not sequential either, but in the close of scrolling through the Ra contact. That is an example of an experience which caused me to become sufficiently motivated to write an informational sequel, which I've titled Concurrence, and which will be pre-released quite soon, but which I will gradually release by reading each working or session on this channel. So I hope you are excited, and the first session will be released very shortly. So thank you for listening, everyone.